Okay, so now we talked about development through voluntary movement and reflexes and locomotor skills. And now what do we say was important about the development of walking, right? That your hands are free. And so now, since we can walk and we can move around and we can stand and our hands are available to manipulate objects, then we are talking about object control skills. So the first thing when we're thinking about the development of object control, and these are your fundamental skills. So this is beyond the voluntary movements that we already talked about. It's beyond just reaching and grasp. This is what, think about sports skills is what we're going to talk about in this chapter. So when you're looking at the differences between the beginning stages of development of that skill and the mature stage of development of that skill, what you're going to notice is a change in the degrees of freedom. And if you'll notice, I mentioned this term when we were talking about locomotor skills, and you probably were all like, what is that? I don't know what that word means. So here we are. We're going to explain it. So degrees of freedom. If you are to look at any of your joints in the body, right, so your elbow, your knee, your toes, your ankles, those are joints. They can move a certain number of ways, and that is what defines your degrees of freedom. So, for example, talking about any of these joints, let's just start with your elbow, because that's easy, right? If you are to throw a ball, your elbow only moves flexion and extension. It only moves in the sagittal plane. Remember, we talked about the sagittal plane cuts you in half in right and left sides. Okay, so you only move in that direction, sagittal plane, flexion and extension. Okay, so, and then your wrist can move in two directions. Okay, so flexion and extension, just like your elbow in the sagittal plane, but it also has the ability to abduct and adduct in the frontal plane. Okay, so frontal planes, if you're dividing yourself into front and back sections, okay, which makes sense, frontal, front and back, okay? So you can move your wrist two different ways, flexion, extension, or abduction, adduction. Your shoulder, you can move, you can do flexion, extension, sagittal plane, you can do abduction, adduction in the frontal plane, and then you get one more, which is the horizontal abduction, which is in the transverse plane, which is if you cut yourself into top and bottom sections. Okay, so if we start adding all of that up, oh, and I forgot to mention your elbow, you can also rotate. It's really a different joint, but it's located at the same place. Okay, so that's why you end up with two there. So 3, 2, 2. So all the directions that you can move in those joints, those areas, right? So that's a lot to control. You're controlling your joint in any of those areas, any of those different paths of movement every time you move. And so what happens when we're young, our brain says that's really way too complicated to control all the joints, so I'm just going to control one at a time, right? So when the babies, the toddlers, when they're starting to learn skills, what you see is a very stiff movement because your body is limiting the degrees of freedom. All right, so we simplify to as few joints as possible to complete the task early on in the stages. And once we can get a hang of controlling those joints, then we start to add on more joints. And so you see this freeing of your body. So if you were to look at a toddler throwing a ball, right, it's really jerky. Their hand is up, and they mostly just move their elbow and release with their fingers, right? Just a really jerky, quick, I have the ball, and then I drop it. Okay, and then what does mature form look like? You're not just using your elbow, right? We rotate to the side, we step with one foot, we pull our arm all the way back so that we're now activating our shoulder, and we turn with our trunk and throw the ball. So we're using our whole body. We've opened up all the degrees of freedom in the mature form, and you're going to see that in every type of skill, that it's really stiff because they're limiting degrees of freedom in early development, and more mobile, so releasing degrees of freedom as they develop mature form. So talking about degrees of freedom, you're really talking about how many joints are involved in this skill. Okay, so when we separate out, when we're talking about any one skill, you have the preparation part of the skill, the actual execution, and then the follow through, right? So if I'm going to throw a ball, my preparatory movement is to bring my arm back, right? Some kind of wind up. And then the actual throwing of the ball and releasing is the execution. And then I follow through by bringing my arm down and across. And that just helps to absorb that energy and make the movement more efficient, right? So the more joints that are involved in the movement, the more force is applied. So we're becoming more efficient. So preparation, execution, and follow through. If you were to, you're doing striking, that's the same thing, right? You're going to bring your on the back behind you in preparation. You'll swing through, that's execution, and then after contact, you keep moving, right? You don't just hold it there, and that's the follow through. Okay, so each of your movements is going to have those preparation, execution, and follow through phases. And if you notice when we were looking at locomotor skills, some of the terms were different, but you saw that same thing with performance of locomotor skills. You see like think about jumping. The preparation was bending your knees and bringing your arms back. You leap up, and then when you land, you absorb the force. That's the same three types of divisions of that skill. So we want to look at each aspect of the skill performance when we're doing assessment. So the first object control skill that they're looking at is two-handed catching. So with both hands, so this would be a ball that would be big enough to need two hands, right? And so with early development, what's the first thing? If you're teaching a kid, a young kid, a toddler to catch a ball, you tell them stick their arms out, right? We're coaching them wrong, right? We tell them stick their arms out because in the mature form, we don't hold our arms out waiting for the ball. We keep our arms kind of by our side but loose, and then we move our arms towards the ball as it comes to us, right? We don't just hold them out there and wait in the mature form. The same thing, they're not stepping towards the ball in the early development, and a lot of times they react too late, so they don't react to the ball until it hits them, and so it's going to either bounce off or they may end up kind of rolling the ball into them and trapping against their body. They're not just able to catch it with their hands in early development like they are in late development. So I know that's hard to imagine without a picture, so let's look at some pictures. And these are the charts from your book. If you want to follow along and look closer, it gives you descriptions of each of the stages. So you can see here this kid is reacting too late, right? The ball hits him before he starts to close his hands. Okay, and then in the next phase, we're kind of moving our hands towards the ball, but we're still not able to catch it with our hands. We're having to catch it with our body. Okay, and then now we're looking at the ball. We're actually looking at the target instead of the person throwing it to us. So that's helping. We're getting it a little bit earlier, but we're still really trapping it with the ball. And so it's in the final stages that we're watching the ball. We're moving towards the ball with our hands as it approaches us, and then absorbing the force of the ball. Okay. So girls actually develop catching a little bit faster than boys by about 6 months. So keep that in mind for those of you who may be coaching T-ball. Okay, with throwing, so catching and throwing kind of goes together. With throwing, I think we're going to focus on the one-handed throw. You see development, again, we're opening up the degrees of freedom by switching from just a sagittal plane movement with just the elbow to a transverse plane where we're integrating the legs and the hip and trunk movement. So you'll see that switch. We start stepping with our throw, so towards the direction of the throw instead of just standing there. And we change the angle of release, so it'll be a little bit more of a straight throw than a lob. So when we're talking about in your paper, we're talking about things that factors that may influence performance. And so some of those things could be for girls, and is having an older brother predicts whether they're going to be good at it, right? If their older brother is out there playing, then they want to play with their brother. So they're going to get more practice and more experience because they're around people who are performing this skill. So they're going to be more likely to participate in a softball or t-ball if they have an older brother, and that gives them more experience, which ends up making them better. Boys, it's going to be more if their dad plays the sport. So if dad plays baseball or softball, adult league softball, then the boy's more likely to get involved, right? They want to be like dad. And then if dad is going and taking them out in the back to play catch, then that is a predictor of their ability to throw. Okay, so motivation and experience. So with throwing development, you're going to see the same thing. We're going to see changes in the windup. So here we're really not going back very far. They are surprisingly stepping in early throwing. And then the release here. Okay, so you see a little bit of a windup, little bit of a step, little bit of release. Okay, and then here you see they start to turn their body, but the movement still looks really jerky and inefficient. But by the final stages of development, you see that the whole body is moving in a very coordinated and efficient way through the windup, over the head, turning the trunk and hips to throw the ball, and the back leg comes forward as well. So here you see like a bigger difference. You know, most of the time we've seen like a 6-month to 1 year difference. Here we're seeing a really huge gap between development of throwing for boys and development of throwing for girls. And that's probably, we'll talk about social factors, but it's probably a social factor that's predicting their practice and experience with throwing at an early age.